Pokemon 2D Sprites. If you played Pokemon during Gen 5 through, well, Gen 5, then you'll have experienced one of the coolest additions to the game, which were 2D sprites. Except in this case, they were also animated. But the reason I'm making these videos is to see if the animations of these 2D sprites could look just as good as they do in 3D. Since, you know, I'm sometimes good at 3D animation. Anyways, since 3D models were introduced in Gen 6, that means the cutoff for which Pokemon that have an animated sprite will be restricted to all the regions before Kalos. That means only Unova, Sinnoh, Hoenn, Johto, and Kanto are the 5 regions that we can actually pull Pokemon from that have 2D animated sprites that can be remade into 3D. Since there are like, you know, 700-ish Pokemon available between the 5 regions, I decided to just showcase 3 of them or else I would never be able to get this video out. And for any of you wondering, no, I will not do all 700 of these Pokemon. It took like an hour for like all 3 Pokemon in this video. Well, actually technically 2 hours for one of them, but I'll explain that one a little bit later. However, I did categorize all 3 Pokemon in this video based on easy, medium, and hard difficulty of the experience I had of animating these Pokemon. With all that out of the way, we can start with the first Pokemon on the list, Victini. Victini, the small, pointy-eared, 3-fingered Pokemon with apparently infinite energy? Victini being a walking power plant aside, its 2D sprite animation doesn't have much complexity to it, which isn't a bad thing, but the animation consists of it moving its spine up and down while simultaneously moving the rest of the other notable parts like its ears, arms, and wings that are for some reason attached to its legs. As for the first half, it was actually pretty easy, but the only annoying thing about this was that I had to keep reusing the same frames and putting them in different places. Now sure, I was just copying and pasting, but repeating the same thing was getting quite boring for me. However, the second half did give me a breath of fresh air, because the second half has Victini hopping on each foot and then landing to then loop the animation all over again. Because you know, this was originally intended for a game, so it would be kinda weird if the animation just stopped and then stayed like that for the rest of the battle. But this part was actually pretty simple, as there was really only 3 poses I had to do for the model, which was here, here, and here. And then just rearrange them so that when the animation is played, Victini would actually be hopping from one side to the other. But with that, I'm going to show the full 3D animation now. With them side to side, I'm actually pretty happy with how this one came out, as it looks very close to the original, although I wish I was able to add a bit more of a bouncy feeling to the hopping part, but this is still good enough. With Victini now finished, we can move on to the next Pokemon, that being Lilligant. Alright, Lilligant, let me see. Hold on. Are those supposed to be feet? Okay, as for Lilligant, the animation starts off with some simple leaf movement with some slight up and down stretching with whatever this is called. Then it moves its body side to side while standing in place. Now the first part was fine until I got to the squashing of its lower body, which was a bit strange at first, which it ended up looking a bit different in comparison to the original, but it still works out. Just don't play it under 30 frames per second. Animating the side to side movement wasn't necessarily hard, but I tilted Lilligant too much, which made it look more like a metronome instead of having the graceful and subtle movements in its original sprite. So I just toned down the rotation and removed some keyframes, and it looks a lot closer to the original. But after a bit more tuning and slight fixes, here is the Lilligant animation. Just like the Victini animation, I'm pretty satisfied with how this one came out as well. That means we can move on to the final Pokemon for this video, that being Hydreigon. Alright, Hydreigon. Yeah, remember when I mentioned earlier about one of the Pokemon taking 2 hours alone? Yep, that was Hydreigon. You see, Hydreigon's design is more complicated than Victini and Lilligant, mainly because of its wings. Now, the wings weren't the only problem, as when I tried to recreate Hydreigon's animation the first time, I ended up with a broken and jittery mess that had to be completely overhauled. Since there were many problems like the arm movement being janky, the ascension into the air was terrible, and the wings were a complete stuttering mess, just like my voice recordings, considering at the time of making this, I'm on my 340th take. Since I didn't like the initial result, I decided to scrap the whole thing and start from the beginning. Now, going into Hydreigon a bit more in depth, the wings may look annoying, but they were still extremely annoying. So much in fact that I had to actually end up deleting a lot of the keyframes from the wings just for it to look somewhat passable. However, that's fine, because it was actually a little easier to make the snapping motion of the arm head, arm head, arm. Anyways, I wasn't able to completely recreate that part of the animation, so I had to alter it slightly for my own convenience, time, and sanity. Then we move on to Hydreigon's tail, which was actually the easiest part of this process, as it's just a swaying motion in sync with Hydreigon's movements. But after a few more changes and tweaks, here's the completed Hydreigon animation. This took me almost 3 hours to completely finish, and you know the crazy part? I'm not that happy with it. Yeah, it looks fine, but it feels like I could have done better if I just freestyled it a bit more, or used a reference like a proper animator beyond just looking at the 2D sprites. But with Hydreigon finished, my final thoughts on this is that I did have some fun animating and recreating the 2D animations into 3D, but I would definitely prefer animating without a specific guideline. But you guys do let me know if you would want to see this again down below, or something similar in concept, as there are still a good amount of Pokemon left to choose from. Finally, with that said, do the 3D animations hold up to the 2D sprite originals? They're okay. The sprites are still better.